Hello, and welcome back to yet another episode of the Gateways Podcast. This is episode 16, continuing on our series about arranging, instrumentation, and quality of sound. So today I'm going to be focusing on mainly just arranging techniques and what you should, look into and what you should use whenever you're doing your arranging for a piece of music. Now, I try to be general, like these aren't things that apply to specifically a singular genre. They can apply to multiple genres if you know how to use them. But let's just get right into it. So, firstly, the most important thing you need to realize, especially if you're a newer composer, is the importance of silence. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that things don't always need to be happening at the same time. Like, you don't need to have every instrument playing all the time with one another. You can have instruments come out, you can have there be periodic moments of silence. It's very important to not just create like constant noise, because then that's all it is, kind of noise. Now there are particular styles of music that do use these kind of sound walls in their creation, but even then they still have to use some form of silence. If you take up all of the space within a piece of music, it almost has no room to breathe and to like really have much tension, because if you just have so much information being fired at a listener at one time, it's not really going to be as impactful. So when you're writing something, keep in mind that having moments of silence is very important. And I remember when I was originally starting to write, that was one of my bigger problems, is that I kept on trying to fill the space, when in reality I should have been embracing the space and finding ways to use that space to improve my melodic and harmonic ideas. So that's definite, kind of rule one. Realize the importance of silence within music, because it can be incredibly powerful. Let's move on to second set, knowing chord voicings based on what you're arranging and the instruments you're arranging for. Now, there are kind of two ways of doing this. You can do it in the theoretical way or the just using your own ears. But knowing how you want to voice a chord in a particular instance is very important, because a chord can have different feelings and colors depending on how you voice it, either on a singular instrument or on multiple instruments. What's an example? Well, let's say you're writing a 5-part saxophone solo line and you want to harmonize it. It's a melodic line. Well, so that would be 2 altos, 2 tenors, and a bari. Well, if you're going to write harmony for that, you need to think, okay, well, if we're using standard jazz, then each chord will most likely be comprised of 4 notes, because 7th chords are really common. But there's 5 instruments. So, first things first, you gotta think, okay, how am I going to get a 4-note chord across 5 instruments? Well, you need to have an octave somewhere. Normally it's done with the alto and the bari, and then you kind of distribute chord tones descending depending on the melodic line. But also, it's like if you're writing a piece for a piano, the difference between having a closed voicing for a chord or a more open voicing for a chord, or which intervals are closer together or further apart, is very important in producing color with that chord, because you can use the same 5 notes in so many different ways and have so many different colors and feelings behind them that you really just have to experiment with it within your own music. You think of things like inversions, or just I'm gonna take the 3rd from this and move it down an octave, and then take the 9th and move it to be a 2nd. It's entirely up to you, the voicing that you want to use to create the emotion you want. So that's very important to keep in mind, is how you're voicing your chords within a piece of music. And then, kind of going off of that, you have how are the instruments like performing interplay between one another? How are they interacting with one another within a piece of music? Is it the way that you want them to interact? Is there an instrument that would do that interaction better, etc.? Like, you know, let's say you have a string quartet that's normally 3 violins and a cello. You have your standard string quartet, and you think, okay, well, I want to add something to this. Well, I remember there was a arrangement video done by David Bruce, who's a composer, with Adam Neely, Tant Krul, and Nari Sol, in which they wrote for a string quartet, but that string quartet also had an accordion, and that accordion sounded fantastic with the string quartet, because the 2 different sounds were able to perform so nicely together. So, you know, when you're arranging, when you're writing a piece of music, you have to think, okay, how will these different sounds interact with one another? How will I make them interact with one another? How will they, you know, harmonize with one another? What's the difference in their timbre and like the volume of their harmonics, and how is that influencing my piece overall, etc. So it's very important to keep in mind musical interplay. And I remember before I mentioned the whole sound wall thing. Like, to explain what a sound wall is, it's like the concept of constantly stacking instrumental voicings to create this, you know, very grand, massive moment of sound, which in the right context sounds fantastic. If you want a good example of someone who uses a lot of sound wall, you have like Louis Zong is a good example. You have Jacob Collier does it a lot. I know that Andrew Huang is writing a song right now called Super Bloom, which uses that in the vocal form. And there are a lot of like, you know, I think maybe Tangerine by the Four Freshmen is a good song with like the brass hits. But yeah, making like sound walls it is a good technique, but it should be used in the right context. And then now moving on more into like, you know, harmonic structures, dissonance and release. You have to know, like, if you're going to use a chord that's incredibly complex, like, let's say it's like a D flat major with a dominant 7th, a 9th sharp 11th, like a 13th, whatever. You know, you have to know that in the next chord, all of the notes within the previous chord have to resolve somewhere. You can't just leave a note and not resolve it. Like, there has to be somewhere for all of those notes to go, right? And that's very important, because if you leave unresolved dissonance, then the motion to the resolution won't be as good. So it's kind of like the more notes you use in a chord, the more responsible you are to make sure all of those notes resolve somewhere. So it's definitely more challenging, but it can also bring about a lot more emotion. And that kind of goes into another thing. Despite what people say about things like, you know, triads, they can be very powerful in the right context. Like, I know everyone's like, oh yeah, no, you gotta add all these tensions and like whatever to make this an actual chord. Triads aren't, you know, complex enough to be used. And that's not really true. In the right context, a triad can do things that chords with tensions couldn't, because sometimes you don't want that tension as a part of your piece of music. So it's very important to keep your options open, because the big thing that happens is once you learn how to do something more complex, you're more inclined to do it, and you leave behind these simpler concepts. But, you know, it's like, it actually shows that you're more brave if you're willing to use triadic harmony at times, instead of like this overly complex tension and dissonance based harmony, because you're willing to step away from the complexity and just say, okay, I want to write a piece of music. And that kind of brings me into the next section, which is talking about experimentation. It's very important to experiment with how you want to arrange and write your music. what instruments you want to use, harmonic lines, melodic lines, rhythmic lines. It's always good to experiment and, try to discover something new with every piece of music you write. Like, I remember I was practicing some vocal melodies, and the way I was practicing them was I was testing interval dissonance with an E3 sine drone that was going in the background. And I remember I was listening to it with headphones, and I was doing it where I could hear my voice in my own head. And every single time I reached, it wasn't perfectly in tune, like it was a microtone, but at the same time the frequency caused, like the dissonance in the two frequencies caused by their ratio being more complex, sounded like it could be a subdivision for a rhythm. So I started looking into that and like how I could incorporate it into my music to have like a harmonic dissonance with, rhythmic consonants, and I actually thought it sounded pretty interesting. And it's another tool to be used in writing my music. And then also you always be thinking about what emotions do you want to convey with this piece. Even if the emotion you're going for is a complete lack of emotion, that's still an emotion, believe it or not. Right? You constantly need to be thinking about, okay, does this chord feel right? Does this melodic feel right? Does this rhythm feel right? Does this sound feel right? That's always very important when you're writing a piece of music, because as said by Herbie Hancock, music is all about life and emotion. And if you can't really embody that within your music, then it's not really music. So that's kind of like the basics of arranging and composing, keeping those things in mind: the importance of silence, chord voicings, interplay, dissonance and consonance, complexity, experimentation, and emotion. Those are like the 7 important things, at least in my book, of composing a piece of music. So with that being said, I'm gonna sign off for today. Good morning, afternoon, night, wherever you are in the world, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Gateways podcast.